Early in the morning on May 13, 2021, the age-old tranquility of the rural community of Oak Haven, nestled in the backwoods of Appalachian, Ohio, was torn apart by a gut-wrenching wail. The mournful, soul-searing cry came from the small house belonging to Caleb Hayes, known throughout the community as one of its gentlest souls. The sound was like a blade slicing through the morning air, causing the country folk preparing for their day's labor to freeze, their hearts filled with a dreadful uncertainty. At first, the sound was just choked, bitter sobs, but within minutes, it erupted into desperate, crazed screams that echoed through the small cluster of houses. Martha, an elderly woman who lived next door to Caleb, was the first to be jolted awake. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was not the sound of a fussy baby or a couple's quarrel. The sound cutting into her ears was the sound of tragedy, of an irreplaceable loss. A gut feeling told her something was terribly wrong. She hastily threw on a thin robe, slipped her feet into her slippers, and scurried over, muttering prayers under her breath. The creaky wooden door to Caleb's house was slightly ajar, unlatched. Martha pushed it open, her hand trembling. The scene before her made the old woman, who had seen nearly everything life had to offer, stop dead in her tracks. The house was small, barely 300 square feet, and sparsely furnished with nothing of value besides an old television and a worn wooden dining set. On the packed dirt floor knelt Clara Hayes, Caleb's beautiful young wife. Her long hair, usually tied up in a neat bun, was now undone, matted with tears and dirt against her face. She wore a flimsy nightgown, her hands beating rhythmically against the hard floor as she let out hollow, soulless cries. On the single bamboo frame bed in the house, Caleb Hayes lay motionless. He was still in the cement-stained work clothes he had worn the day before. It seemed he had fallen asleep the moment he lay down, utterly exhausted. But this was no ordinary sleep. His skin was pale, his lips had turned a purplish hue. His eyes were closed, his face still etched with fatigue but now completely devoid of life. Martha trembled as she approached, reaching out a bony finger to touch Caleb's nose. There was no warmth, no breath. Panicked, she placed a hand on his chest. It was not moving. Beneath the thin shirt, his body was already cold and rigid. Martha shrieked that Caleb was dead, her legs giving way as she nearly collapsed. Martha's scream and Clara's wails drew other neighbors to the house. Soon, the small home was packed with people. The air grew thick, a mixture of the musty smell of the poor house, the sweat of the crowd, and a chilling, unmistakable scent of death. A middle-aged man, the community elder, asked what had happened, noting that Caleb had been fine just last night. It was as if Clara had been waiting for that question. She lifted her beautiful face, now ravaged by grief, and crawled toward the bed. Sobbing, she pointed to her husband's right ankle, which was grotesquely swollen and bruised a dark purple. She cried that a snake had bitten him. She explained that he had come home from work so tired the night before, complaining of back pain. He ate a quick bite and then fell into a dead sleep. She suggested that due to the heat, a venomous snake must have crawled in and bitten him, and he never even knew. That morning, she had tried to wake him, but he would not get up. He was already cold. She told her story between sobs, her words broken but horrifically logical, a logic that resonated with the fears of the rural folk. All eyes turned to Caleb's ankle. In the dim morning light, they could clearly see 2 tiny puncture marks in his skin, the unmistakable sign of a venomous snake. The area around the bite was swollen and had turned a dark, bruised purple. It looked terrifying. The situation seemed painfully clear. In this hilly, wooded region, it was not uncommon for snakes to enter houses, especially on hot summer nights. And it was just as common for a man exhausted from a day of hard labor to sleep so soundly he would not know what hit him. A brave young man grabbed a long pole and cautiously poked under the bed, the darkest and dampest spot. After a few clattering sounds, the body of a large copperhead snake, as thick as a man's wrist and over 3 feet long, was dragged out. Its head was crushed, likely by Caleb himself in his final, unconscious moments. At this point, any last shred of doubt in the minds of the simple country people vanished completely. The evidence was too clear, too convincing. It was a tragic accident, nothing more, nothing less. The entire community of Oak Haven was plunged into a state of shock and grief. They mourned for the gentle, hard-working Caleb, who had died such a senseless and sudden death. They pitied his young widow and their 5-year-old son, now left without a father. Amidst the chaos and sorrow, Jason Meyer, the wealthy neighbor, also rushed over. He burst into the house, his face a mask of shock and pain, as if he were a close relative. He pushed through the crowd to support Clara, who was fainting into the arms of other women, and comforted her with heartfelt words. He told her to be strong to arrange things for Caleb, assuring her that he and the neighbors were there and would take care of everything. Jason's presence and his responsible, concerned attitude, in the eyes of the villagers, was a testament to the strong community spirit of neighbors helping each other in times of need. No one suspected a thing when, as Jason supported Clara, he gave her hand a gentle, almost imperceptible squeeze. And in a fleeting moment that no one noticed, the two of them exchanged a look, heavy with hidden meaning. Their perfect play had just begun. Clara's wails continued to echo, so raw and so real that no one could have guessed they were not tears of pain, but tears of relief. The sudden and tragic death of Caleb Hayes could not disrupt the customs that were deeply ingrained in the consciousness of the people of Oakhaven. The funeral was arranged quickly, following traditional rites. The small house, already cramped, became even more suffocating with the constant stream of visitors paying their respects. The thick, sweet smell of incense mixed with the scent of people and the musty air, creating an atmosphere that was both sorrowful and oppressive. The mournful drone of a lone fiddle played by a local musician cut through the air like a knife, twisting in the hearts of those left behind. Among the mourners, the most grief-stricken were undoubtedly Brenda Hayes and Sarah Reed, Caleb's mother and older sister. As soon as they received the terrible news the previous morning, the two women had rushed over from the next county, nearly collapsing at the sight of their beloved son and brother's body. Their pain was real, their tears were real. Brenda, the elderly mother in her 60s, had cried herself hoarse, her eyes swollen and vacant as she stared at her son's coffin. And Sarah, the strong, resilient older sister, though trying to hold back her grief to manage the arrangements, could not stop her shoulders from shaking, the injustice of fate etched deep in her red-rimmed eyes. In stark contrast to the silent agony of Caleb's mother and sister was the performance of his widow, Clara. She remained by the coffin, weeping and wailing dramatically. She lamented about her memories with her late husband, about their unfinished plans, about the bleak future that now faced her and their son. Her cries were loud and theatrical, earning her the sympathy of all the neighbors. They gathered around to comfort her, believing that her grief was so profound because she had loved her husband so deeply. However, to Sarah, a sharp and perceptive woman, her sister-in-law's act had too many flaws. She noticed that Clara wailed loudly and cried pitifully, but her eyes were almost completely dry. She only put on the show when there was a crowd. In quieter moments, she would sit silently, her gaze distant and empty, a void that contained no pain. And what unsettled Sarah the most was that every time Clara cried to the point of near collapse, the person who was always there at the right moment to catch her was not Sarah or any of the other women, but Jason Meyer. The neighbor had been present since early morning, and his attentiveness was disturbingly excessive. He was running around, helping with everything from setting up tents and chairs to greeting guests. He always stood near Clara, constantly whispering words of comfort that seemed far too intimate. He was playing the part of a good neighbor, a close family friend, but his concern for the widow had a possessive, inappropriate quality. That afternoon, when the number of visitors had thinned, Sarah happened to walk to the back of the house and stumbled upon a scene that made her freeze. Behind a stand of banana trees, Jason was giving Clara a bowl of soup, his hand gently wiping a tear from her cheek. Clara did not pull away, she even leaned her head weakly against his shoulder. This was not the act of a neighbor comforting a grieving widow. This was the intimacy of lovers. The way they looked at each other, though only for a second, was enough for Sarah to see everything. The suspicion that had been a smouldering ember in her heart now erupted into a furious blaze. She suddenly remembered the rumors about their illicit affair, rumors she had always dismissed as malicious gossip. But the decisive turning point, the detail that would blow the entire charade apart, came from the most unexpected witness of all, 5-year-old Leo Hayes. Leo had not cried since it happened. The 5-year-old did not seem to understand what death was, nor why his house was suddenly so full of people and noise. He was just scared. He huddled in a corner of the house, his big, round eyes wide and bewildered, flinching at the sound of the fiddle or his mother's screams. He looked at the coffin in the middle of the room, where people said his daddy was taking a very, very long nap. Seeing her nephew all alone, Sarah's heart ached. No matter what she suspected of Clara, Leo was still her brother's blood, the nephew she adored. She walked over, gently scooped him into her arms, and carried him out to the backyard where the air was less suffocating. She asked him softly if he was hungry and why he was sitting all by himself. Leo snuggled into his aunt's shoulder, his voice a tiny whisper. He said he was not hungry, just scared. He noted that his mommy and everyone else kept crying. Sarah held her nephew tightly, telling him it was okay and there was nothing to be scared of because she was there. She asked if he missed his daddy. The little boy nodded, his clear eyes looking up at her. He asked where his daddy had gone. His mommy said he was sleeping, but he wondered why he was sleeping for so long. The innocent question was like a fist squeezing Sarah's heart. She fought back tears, trying to find the right words to explain. She told Leo that his daddy had to go to a place far, far away, that he was very tired and needed to rest. She suddenly remembered something, a flicker of hope. She asked him if anything strange had happened the night before his daddy went to sleep, and if he could tell her. She had only asked casually, never expecting that her nephew's answer would be the key to unlocking a horrifying truth. Leo, in the innocent world of a 5-year-old, knew nothing of lies. He simply recounted what he had seen, images that were seared into his young mind. The boy began his sleepy tale, explaining that last night, his daddy drank the medicine his mommy gave him, and then he fell into a very, very deep sleep. He had called for him, but he did not wake up. Sarah froze. She asked if his daddy was sick and why he needed medicine. Leo said he did not know. He saw his mommy put some little white pills in a cup of water for his daddy to drink. She said it was vitamins to make him strong. Sarah's heart began to pound. She tried to keep her voice as normal as possible as she asked what happened next. Leo continued, as innocently as if he were telling a fairy tale. He said his daddy fell asleep, and then Uncle Jason from next door came over. Uncle Jason brought a snake with him and made it bite his daddy on the leg. His daddy made a small sound of pain but did not wake up. Then, he said, his mommy and Uncle Jason went to sleep hugging in the bedroom. Every word from the child was like a sledgehammer blow to Sarah's head. The world around her seemed to spin. She had to grab onto a house post to keep from falling. The shock was so immense she could not believe her own ears. She stammered, asking Leo if he was sure he did not see it wrong. The boy insisted he was not wrong, and even described it in detail. The snake was all black and made a scary hissing sound. After it bit his daddy, it tried to crawl away, but Uncle Jason caught it and hit it with a stick until it was dead, then pushed it under the bed. He added that Uncle Jason had to hold it really tight to make it bite his daddy's leg. At that moment, all the scattered pieces clicked into place, forming a complete and horrifying picture of a crime. The child's testimony, Clara's fake grief, Jason's suspicious behavior, and the past rumors, it all fit. Her brother had not died in an accident. He had been brutally murdered by his own wife and their heartless neighbor. They had staged a perfect crime, and their only witness was their own 5-year-old son. A terrible rage erupted within Sarah, overwhelming her grief. She could not let her brother die in vain. She could not let those two demons get away with it. She carried Leo back into the house, handed him to a relative, and went straight to her mother, who was sitting numbly beside the coffin. She pulled her mother into a quiet corner and, leaning close, told her everything Leo had just said. Brenda listened, and her vacant eyes suddenly widened, a look of ultimate horror and pain crossing her aged face. The two women looked at each other. Without another word, they had come to the same decision. Just then, the funeral musicians began to play the final, mournful dirge, signaling that it was time for the procession to the cemetery. A few strong young men from the village were preparing to lift the coffin. A powerful, steely shout to wait and stop cut through the music. Everyone turned in stunned silence. Sarah, her face a mask of cold fury, stepped out from the house and stood directly in front of her brother's coffin. Her eyes, burning with fire, stared straight at Clara and Jason, who were standing together, making them both flinch and step back. She repeated for everyone to stop, her voice clear and deliberate. She declared that her brother was murdered. Their family would not bury him. They were calling the police. Sarah's steely declaration was like a bomb detonating in the somber atmosphere of the funeral. The music stopped abruptly. The wailing ceased. Everyone, from close relatives to neighbors, turned to stare at her in disbelief. In the yard, the young men preparing to carry the coffin froze, unsure of what to do next. The sudden silence became heavy, so tense you could hear the wind rustling through the leaves. Clara was the first to react. She, who was being supported by Jason, flinched as if struck. The grief-stricken expression on her face was instantly replaced by a deathly pallor. She stared at her sister-in-law and stammered, questioning what she was talking about. She insisted Caleb died from a snake bite and that everyone saw it, asking why Sarah would say he was murdered. Jason quickly chimed in, trying to mask the panic in his eyes with feigned indignation. He agreed, saying that losing Caleb was painful enough and questioned why Sarah was saying such crazy things. He told her that if she did not care about her sister-in-law, she should at least think of Caleb's spirit. But Sarah was unyielding. Her eyes, like two burning torches, bore into the adulterous couple. She snarled that the police would find out soon enough whether she was crazy or not. She refused to let her brother be buried while being slandered as a victim of an accident. She then told her mother to go inside. With that, ignoring the stunned gasps of the crowd, she helped her mother back into the house and slammed the door shut, leaving the growing whispers and speculation to fester outside. The tragic play had ended, making way for a raw and terrifying truth that was about to be exposed. Just over an hour later, 2 police cruisers, sirens wailing, turned down the narrow dirt road leading into Oakhaven, drawing the curious eyes of the entire village. The officer in command was Detective Mark Riley, a veteran of the Major Crimes Unit. He was a sharp, seasoned officer with nearly 15 years of experience handling hundreds of major cases. Stepping out of his car and seeing the chaotic crowd and the tense atmosphere, he knew this was no simple matter. With professional efficiency, Detective Riley ordered his deputies to establish a security perimeter, asking all unrelated individuals to leave the scene. He entered the small house where Sarah and her mother were waiting. Clara and Jason were also ordered to be present. After listening to Sarah, her voice trembling with rage, recount the innocent yet chilling testimony of young Leo, Detective Riley was silent for a long moment. His sharp gaze swept across each face in the room. He saw the profound pain of the mother, the fierce determination of the sister, and he paid very close attention to the demeanor of Clara and Jason. He saw Clara with her head bowed, wringing her hands, her shoulders trembling an image of fear and injustice. He saw Jason, in contrast, trying to appear calm, almost defiant. Detective Riley stated calmly but authoritatively that they had noted her statement. However, the words of a 5-year-old child could not be the sole basis for an investigation. He then announced that he needed to hear from the 2 of them, turning to Clara and Jason and asking them to recount the events of the night of May 12th and the morning of the 13th. Clara and Jason, seemingly prepared, began to tell the story they had agreed upon. Clara, playing the grieving widow once more, repeated the script about her husband coming home tired, sleeping soundly, and being bitten by a snake. She added meticulous details about Caleb complaining of back pain, about her making him lemonade before bed. Jason, playing the good neighbor, confirmed that he had rushed over in the morning when he heard the screams and had seen the dead snake under the bed with his own eyes, along with everyone else. Another detective asked about Leo's story and why he would say he saw the 2 of them bring a snake in to bite his father. Clara immediately burst into tears, crying out about how miserable she was. Her husband had just died, and now she had to endure this terrible accusation. She claimed the boy was just a child, in shock from his father's death, and was just confused, mixing up dreams and reality. She begged the officers to believe her. Jason quickly added that it was true. He suggested the kid probably had a nightmare or overheard some gossip and was repeating it, reminding them he was just a child who did not know any better. He expressed pity for her and the boy. Their performance was smooth. The explanation that the child was traumatized and confused sounded plausible. But Detective Riley was not easily fooled. Experience had taught him that the more a suspect tries to appear calm and offer a reasonable explanation, the more suspicious they are. He noted that throughout their statements, neither Clara nor Jason would look him directly in the eye. Beads of sweat had formed on Jason's forehead, though the room was not hot. Detective Riley cut off their act. He said that they had recorded their statements, but to clarify the truth, clear the innocent, and bring peace to the deceased, they would need to conduct an autopsy. He stated that this was a mandatory legal procedure in any death with suspicious circumstances. At the word autopsy, the expressions of both Clara and Jason changed dramatically. Clara stopped crying and looked up, her eyes wide with panic. Jason flinched, his brow furrowing. Though fleeting, These reactions did not escape Detective Riley's trained eye. He knew he had hidden nerve. Clara suddenly shrieked that it was not allowed. She cried that her husband had suffered enough and she did not want his body to be cut up, refusing to agree. Detective Riley replied coldly that it was not a matter of her agreement. It was a decision by the investigating authorities, based on the family's request and circumstances that indicated a possible homicide. He required her cooperation. With that, he signaled for the forensics team waiting outside to enter. Clara tried to rush forward to stop them but was restrained by a female officer. Jason stood there, his face ashen, watching helplessly as the forensic officers carefully placed Caleb's body in a specialized body bag and moved it to the coroner's van. The moment the empty coffin was left behind was the moment the adulterous couple's hopes of concealing their crime began to crumble. After the van carrying the body had left, Detective Riley stood alone in the cold, empty house. The smell of incense still lingered, but the air of mourning had been replaced by the tension of an investigation. He surveyed the scene. It was a well-staged play. The victim, the bite mark, the dead snake. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the love of the victim's family, and most importantly, they could never have anticipated that their crime would have a witness so innocent and pure that no lie could tarnish his words. In Detective Riley's mind, a real battle was being waged. On one side was the fantastical but detailed account of a child. On the other was the denial and the seemingly plausible accident scenario of two adults. He knew the key to solving this case was not here. It was on its way to the autopsy room, about to be discovered under the coroner's scalpel. The truth, no matter how cleverly hidden, was about to be revealed. In the days that followed, a strange and tense atmosphere descended upon Oakhaven. The funeral was postponed indefinitely. Caleb's house was sealed with yellow police tape, becoming a foreign, ominous presence in the middle of the village. Rumors began to spread faster than the wind. No one believed the snakebite story anymore. Leo's testimony, though meant to be confidential, had somehow leaked and become the main topic of every conversation. People began to look at Clara and Jason with different eyes, a mixture of suspicion, contempt, and a little bit of fear. Meanwhile, at the State Forensic Science Center, another search for the truth was underway in silence. Caleb Hayes's body lay on a cold metal table under the stark white fluorescent lights of the autopsy room. The medical examiner, a middle-aged man with a stern face and over 20 years of experience, began his work with meticulous care. The external examination largely confirmed the initial scene. The victim had died from the venom of a copperhead snake, evidenced by the bite marks and the extensive necrosis around his ankle. However, one small detail made the experienced M.e. frown. The victim's body showed no signs of struggle, no scratches or defensive wounds. Typically, when bitten by a venomous snake, even in sleep, the extreme pain would cause the victim to thrash and convulse. But Caleb was different. He lay in an almost completely relaxed posture, as if he had accepted death easily. This was highly unusual. His instincts told him something was wrong. The medical examiner decided to perform a comprehensive toxicology screen. Samples of the victim's blood, stomach contents, and tissue were collected and sent to the lab. This was not a mandatory procedure for a death with a clear cause like a snakebite, but the doctor's experience and caution would not allow him to overlook it. 2 days later, as Detective Riley was in his office reviewing the contradictory statements of Clara and Jason, his phone rang. It was the medical examiner, his voice tinged with excitement. He confirmed it was Detective Riley and announced that he had the toxicology results for the victim, Caleb Hayes, and that they had a major finding. Detective Riley sat up straight, his heart quickening, and asked what the results were. The M.e., his tone serious, stated that besides the copperhead venom, they found a massive concentration of zolpidem in the victim's blood and stomach. Detective Riley frowned, the name zolpidem sounding familiar. The M.e. confirmed it was a powerful prescription sedative, commonly known as Ambien. But that was not the issue. The concentration in the victim's body was abnormally high. They estimated the dosage he ingested was equivalent to at least 5 10 milligrams tablets. The M.e. explained to the detective that this was no longer a therapeutic dose for insomnia, it was a dose used to poison someone, large enough to put a healthy adult into a deep coma, rendering them completely unconscious and unable to resist. That was why he had no reaction when the snake bit him. After hanging up, Detective Riley sat in silence for a few seconds, a cold chill running down his spine. Everything was now clear. The clumsy act put on by Clara and Jason had been officially debunked by irrefutable scientific evidence. Caleb had not been sleeping soundly because he was tired. He had been drugged, poisoned to the point of incapacitation, and then left like a log for the venomous snake to execute a death sentence. Their crime was far more calculated and monstrous than he had imagined. Immediately, Clara was summoned back to the sheriff's department. This time, it was not an informal interview at the scene, it was an official interrogation. Clara walked in, trying to maintain her look of wronged innocence, but her constantly darting eyes betrayed her extreme anxiety. Detective Riley sat across from her, placing a glass of water on the table. He did not threaten or raise his voice. He just looked her straight in the eye, his gaze sharp and piercing. He began, his tone neutral, explaining that they had asked her to come in to clarify a few more details. He informed her that they had the results of Caleb's autopsy and asked if she wanted to know what they were. Clara flinched but tried to remain defiant, telling the officers to go ahead and say what they had to, insisting her husband died from a snake bite and there was nothing else to say. Detective Riley nodded, confirming that the direct cause of death was indeed the snake venom. But, he added, they also found something else, a large quantity of sleeping pills in Caleb's system. Hearing this, Clara's face changed. Her mask of composure began to crack. She stammered that it was not possible, that there were no sleeping pills. Detective Riley's voice grew cold as he told her that science does not lie. He then gave her one last chance to tell the truth, asking why there were sleeping pills in Caleb's system. Clara was truly panicking now. She knew she could not deny it, but with her cunning nature, she decided she would not confess everything. She would admit to a small part, a half-truth, hoping to salvage the situation. She began to cry, confessing that lately her husband had been having trouble sleeping after work. She claimed he had bought some sleeping pills from a pharmacy to help. That night, because he was so tired, she said he took 2 pills himself to help him sleep. She theorized that he must have been sleeping so soundly from the pills that he did not feel the snakebite. She swore she knew nothing else. Her performance was convincing. A wife, terrified, who had hidden the fact that her husband took sleeping pills. It sounded plausible, a belated confession. But she did not know that this lie was the very trap Detective Riley had set, and she had just walked right into it. Detective Riley smirked, a cold, humorless smile. He stood up, walked over to Clara, and placed the official autopsy report on the table in front of her. He pointed a finger directly at the final conclusion. His voice hardening, he questioned her claim that Caleb took 2 pills. He then asked how she could explain the results, which showed the concentration of the drug in the victim's blood was equivalent to ingesting at least 5 pills. He pointed out that this was 2.5 times what she just claimed and 5 times the maximum prescribed dose. He asked if she knew what the medical term for that was. He told her it was called a lethal dose. Every word from Detective Riley was like a hammer blow to Clara's psyche. Her lie had been brutally exposed. She stared at the words on the report, her mind blank. All her calculations, all her prepared scripts, vanished into thin air. She was cornered, with no way out. Clara looked up at Detective Riley, her eyes a mixture of fear, desperation, and hatred. She stopped crying. She just sat there, her body trembling, unable to utter another word. Her silence now was more valuable than any confession. Detective Riley knew he had broken through the first line of defense. It was time to deliver the final blow. Clara's silence in the interrogation room was more damning than any confession. Her clumsy lie about the 2 sleeping pills, shattered by the forensic report, had boomeranged, destroying her final defenses. She had cornered herself, and Detective Riley knew the time had come to deliver the decisive blow. He did not need to ask another question. With scientific proof of a deliberate poisoning and the primary suspect caught in a lie, he had solid legal grounds to request emergency search warrants for the residences of both Clara Hayes and Jason Meyer. He was certain that no matter how cunning the killers were, they could not have erased all physical traces of their planned crime. The warrants were approved that same afternoon. To ensure the element of surprise and prevent the suspects from colluding to destroy evidence, 2 teams were ordered to move out and execute the searches simultaneously. The atmosphere at the sheriff's department was electric. Every officer knew that what they were about to find would be the final pieces of the puzzle, sealing the fate of 2 murderers and closing the tragic case of an innocent man. At Caleb Hayes' house, where Clara now sat alone, the first team entered. The house still smelled of incense from the interrupted funeral, the air cold and mournful. Clara sat on the bamboo frame bed, her face a blank mask, no longer crying or acting. She just watched silently as the officers began their work, the silence of someone who knows they have lost. The search was meticulous. Detectives checked under every floorboard, in every crevice. Their primary goal was to find the source of the zolpidem. They started with the family medicine cabinet, which contained only a few blister packs of cold medicine and some liniment. They moved to the kitchen, checking spice jars, but found nothing. Their hopes turned to the most private area, the bedroom. The bed where Caleb had breathed his last was still an active crime scene. The detectives focused on an old wooden wardrobe where the couple's clothes and personal items were kept. Caleb's clothes were neatly folded on one side, all worn-out work clothes. On the other side, Clara's clothes were more numerous, more colourful, including several dresses that looked brand new, as if never worn in a place like Oakhaven. An experienced female detective, while checking a drawer containing Clara's undergarments, felt something hard hidden at the bottom. She carefully removed the clothes, and there, wrapped in a small handkerchief, was a blister pack of pills. She called out softly to the detective that she had found it. Detective Riley, who was personally supervising the search, hurried over. He put on gloves and carefully picked up the blister pack. The words zolpidem 10 milligrams were clearly printed on the foil. This was the exact drug found in the victim's body. But the most damning detail, the one that made everyone hold their breath, was the number of pills. The pack originally held 10 pills, but now 5 empty slots remained. Exactly 5 pills had been used. This number perfectly matched the forensic conclusion about the dosage Caleb had been given. This was no longer speculation. This was physical evidence, the sinister thread directly linking Clara's actions to her husband's death. At the same time, on the other side of Oakhaven, the second team was searching Jason Meyer's house. In contrast to Clara's humble home, Jason's was a modern, spacious house, a testament to his wealth. Jason, who had been summoned from his construction supply store, was furious and uncooperative. He yelled, questioning what they were doing and on what grounds they were searching his house, threatening to file a complaint against all of them. But his threats were useless. After the detective in charge read the search warrant signed by the district attorney, Jason fell silent, his face pale. He leaned against a wall, watching helplessly as the officers began their work. The search of Jason's house initially yielded little. His home was neat and clean, with nothing suspicious in sight. The team was beginning to think that perhaps Jason was only an accomplice in spirit, while Clara had carried out all the actions. But a young officer, circling around to the large backyard, discovered something unusual. In the farthest corner of the garden, hidden by a dense grove of trees and a pile of old building materials, was a small but sturdy enclosure made of chain-link fence, its top covered with a green top. From the outside, it looked like a normal chicken coop. But as the officer got closer, he heard a distinct hissing sound, a sound that made his skin crawl. He immediately radioed in, reporting a suspicious sign in the back garden. The team rushed over. They tore off the top, and the sight before them was stunning. Inside the secret enclosure were not chickens, but nearly a dozen iron cages. And in each cage was a highly venomous snake, including several large copperheads, the same species found at the crime scene. The adult snakes slithered lethargically, their forked tongues flicking, emitting threatening hisses. Beside the cages were specialized tools for handling snakes, long tongs, hooks, thick leather gloves, and even a few vials of antivenom stored in a small cooler. Jason Meyer was not just a philandering neighbor, he was a professional snake breeder. He possessed the perfect weapon to commit a murder and make it look like an accident. He even had the cure, which proved he understood the danger of the animals he kept. But he had not used it to save a life, he had used the animals themselves to take one. The news from both search teams came back to Detective Riley almost simultaneously. In his office, he placed 2 sealed evidence bags on his desk. One contained the blister pack of sleeping pills, with 5 pills missing. The other contained photos of Jason Meyer's venomous snake enclosure. The picture of the crime was now complete. A perfect murder plot, planned and executed by a cruel pair of lovers. One provided the poison to incapacitate the victim, the other provided the living weapon to deliver the final blow and stage the scene. Their roles were clearly defined. Detective Riley looked at the 2 pieces of evidence, filled with rage but also a sense of relief. The case could essentially be closed with this irrefutable physical evidence. But he knew that to get a full confession, to expose the entire disgusting conspiracy from its inception, he needed one more thing. He needed evidence that could speak. Evidence that could reconstruct their exact thoughts, their conversations. He picked up the phone and called the head of the cybercrimes unit, telling them he needed them to recover all data, especially text messages, from the phones of Clara Hayes and Jason Meyer immediately. The two smartphones, one belonging to Clara and one to Jason, were seized immediately after the searches. They were no longer personal communication devices, they were two black boxes containing the darkest secrets, words, and thoughts encoded into digital data. Both phones were immediately sealed and transported to the state's cybercrime division. There, in a cold room filled with advanced electronics, another silent battle began. The battle to resurrect the truth from ones and zeros. The best technical experts were mobilized. They quickly discovered that the suspects had been careful. The entire call history, SMS messages, and especially the chat logs on a messaging app between two accounts named Broken Moon Clara's and Gravel King Jason's had been wiped clean. On the surface, the phones were pristine, as if the two had never had any deep connection. They had tried to cut the final thread, hoping their criminal conversations would be lost forever in the digital void. But they were wrong. In the digital world, nothing ever truly disappears. Deleted data is not immediately destroyed, it is simply marked by the operating system as free space, ready to be overwritten. As long as that space has not been overwritten, experts with specialized software and tools can recover it. The data recovery began. Complex lines of code scrolled across computer screens. Special hardware was connected to the two phones, beginning a deep extraction from their internal memories. Time passed slowly, tensely. After nearly 24 hours of continuous work, a quiet cheer went up as someone announced they had it. On one expert screen, the first lines of text began to appear. Message by message, the deleted conversation between Clara and Jason was gradually reconstructed, arranged in chronological order. The raw truth, written in the criminal's own words, began to unfold. The full printout of the conversation, dozens of pages long, was placed on Detective Riley's desk. He read every line, and the more he read, the colder his face became with rage. This was not just evidence. This was a devil's diary. Their conversation began several weeks before the murder. At first, it was just flirting and complaining. Clara had written that she was sick of her life, working hard but remaining poor. She expressed disgust for her useless and weak husband, saying she could not stand it anymore. Jason had replied with pity, saying a flower like her should be cherished, not buried in that dump. He suggested she leave him and come with him, promising a good life where she could have anything she wanted. Clara responded that it was easy for him to say, but she worried about her husband and their son, Leo. She described her husband as simple but very jealous, and that he would never agree to a divorce. Clara's bitter words were the kindling, and Jason was the one who poured gasoline on the fire. He did not just encourage her, he began to plant a deadly idea in her head. He told her it was not a problem. All they needed was for him to disappear naturally, in an accident, so no one could say anything. Clara expressed fear, but Jason dismissed it, saying that to get the good life, one had to be willing to take risks. He then made a chilling suggestion, sending him on a surprise trip, courtesy of one of his pets. He noted that snakes were everywhere that time of year, so who would suspect a thing? The idea of a murder disguised as a snakebite accident was born. At first, Clara was hesitant, scared. But Jason continuously used sweet words, painting a beautiful picture of their future together, to persuade her. Finally, greed and hatred won. Clara questioned how it could be done, worrying that her husband was strong and a snakebite might not kill him right away. If he screamed, the whole village would hear. Jason replied that she would have to handle that part. Her job was to make sure her husband was sleeping like the dead, totally out of it, and he would handle the rest. He advised they had to wait for the right time, when he came home from a long trip, at his most tired, when he would sleep the soundest. The evil plan was meticulously laid out. Each had their role. Clara, the wife, was given the cruelest task, to drug her own husband. A few days later, she messaged Jason, telling him she had gotten the pills. She had to go to the city and lie that they were for her old, insomniac mother, but a pharmacy sold her a bottle. And then, the messages from the night of the murder, May 12th, were the most damning proof of their unforgivable crime. At 8:30 p.m., Jason asked if he was home and asleep yet. At 8:32 p.m., Clara replied that he was home eating, that she hated the sight of his face. She had already mixed the medicine and would message him when he was out cold. At 10:15 p.m., she wrote that he was out like a light and told him to come over. The chat went silent for nearly an hour, the time during which they committed their heinous act. And then, the final message of the night, a message that exposed their ultimate depravity, was sent. At 11:05 p.m., Clara messaged that she was scared. She thought Leo had seen something, that she saw him peeking through the crack in the door with his eyes wide open. At 11:10 p.m., Jason told her not to worry, to just tell the boy it was a bad dream because he was just a kid who did not know any better. He instructed her to stay calm and play the part of the grieving widow in the morning, assuring her he would take care of everything. Detective Riley closed the file, his hand trembling slightly with rage. The entire conspiracy, from the initial idea to the detailed planning and even the discussion of how to cover their tracks by exploiting a child's innocence, it was all recorded in these cold, callous messages. This was the final noose, woven from their own words, and it was about to be tightened. There was no escape for these two devils. He picked up the phone and ordered the investigators to bring Clara Hayes and Jason Meyer to interrogation. Immediately, 2 separate, soundproof interrogation rooms were prepared. Clara and Jason were brought in at nearly the same time, but they could not see each other, could not exchange even a single glance. Absolute isolation was the first psychological blow the task force dealt the two killers. They had planned together, acted together, but now they would face justice alone. In interrogation room 1, Jason Meyer sat, trying to puff out his chest and appear calm. But his cuffed hands, resting on the table, trembled uncontrollably, and the beads of cold sweat on his forehead betrayed his absolute terror. He knew the police finding his snake collection was bad, but he clung to the faint hope that it was not the end. He could blame Clara, say she had stolen a snake to harm her husband. Detective Riley entered, followed by a prosecutor and a note-taker. He carried nothing but a thick, neatly bound stack of A4 paper. He sat down opposite Jason, placed the stack on the table, but did not open it. Detective Riley began calmly, informing Jason that based on the search, they had enough evidence to charge him with concealment of a crime and illegal possession of endangered wildlife. However, he believed Jason's crimes did not stop there and that this was his last chance to confess and receive any possible leniency. Jason smirked, a forced, twisted smile. He claimed not to know what the detective was talking about, repeating that he had nothing to do with Caleb's death and was just a good neighbor. He dismissed the snakes as a hobby for making medicinal wine. Detective Riley did not argue. He simply pushed the stack of papers across the table toward Jason, suggesting he should read it before continuing to lie. Jason looked down, and in that instant, his entire facade of composure shattered. The first page was a screenshot of a phone, with 2 chillingly familiar names, Broken Moon and Gravel King. Below were the recovered text messages. Detective Riley began to read aloud, slowly, enunciating each word like a knife thrust into the killer's heart, quoting Jason's own message about sending Caleb on a surprise trip courtesy of one of his pets and how no one would suspect a thing with snakes being everywhere. Jason's eyes bulged, his mouth hung open. He was frozen, a statue of a man. He stared at the words he himself had typed, words he believed had vanished forever. He could not believe the police could do the impossible. Detective Riley turned a page, quoting Jason's message about telling the boy it was a bad dream and instructing Clara to play the part of the grieving widow. He then asked if Jason had anything else to say. The collapse was instantaneous. Jason slumped forward, his head on the table, his shoulders shaking. The sound of a grown man sobbing filled the interrogation room, not the sound of remorse, but of failure, of utter despair, knowing that all his calculations, all his schemes, had been brutally exposed. He wailed that it was Clara, that it was all that bitch's idea. He began the cowardly blame game, claiming she said she was sick of her husband and wanted to be with him, that she had seduced him and he was just blinded by her. But it was too late. The curtain had fallen. At the same time, in interrogation room 2, Clara Hayes had also completely broken down when faced with the same evidence. She no longer cried or screamed. She just sat there, lifeless, and then began to confess her crimes like a robot. The confessions of the 2 killers connected the final pieces, reconstructing a night of horror in the most depraved detail. That night, after Caleb finished dinner, Clara had pretended to be concerned, saying she had bought some vitamins for him because he was so tired. She had crushed 5 zolpidem pills and dissolved them in a glass of water. Caleb, with absolute trust in his wife, drank it all without a second thought. Just 15 minutes later, he was in a deep, comatose sleep, completely defenseless. Once she was sure her husband was unconscious, Clara messaged Jason. He brought a prepared copperhead, snuck into the house, and together they carried Caleb to the bed. Then, the most horrific act took place. Jason used tongs to hold the snake's head, while Clara pulled up her husband's pant leg. Together, they forced the snake's venom-filled fangs deep into the ankle of the helpless man. They held it there for several seconds, ensuring a lethal dose of venom was injected. After the act, they killed the snake, tossed its body under the bed, and then, shamelessly, made love in the bedroom next to the body of her dying husband. The case of the wife who murdered her husband and staged a fake accident for her illicit lover shocked the entire state. A few months later, the trial of Clara Hayes and Jason Meyer began. Before the court, the 2 killers stood with their heads bowed, not daring to look at anyone. They no longer blamed each other, only mumbled their admission of guilt. The jury, after reviewing the entire case file and the aggravating circumstances, found the defendant's actions to be particularly heinous, involving premeditation, planning, and the use of sophisticated means to commit the crime. The motive was vile and selfish. Their actions not only took a human life but trampled on all moral and ethical values, causing unimaginable pain to the victim's family and extreme outrage in the community. The jury concluded that both were beyond rehabilitation and needed to be permanently removed from society. The final verdict was read in a silent courtroom: death for the defendant Clara Hayes and death for the defendant Jason Meyer. Justice was served. But behind the severe sentences was a tragedy with no end. The tragedy of a gentle man who worked his whole life for his family, only to be brutally murdered by his wife and trusted neighbor. The tragedy of a 5-year-old boy who, in one night, lost both his father and his mother and must now carry a horrifying memory for the rest of his life. The case closed, but it left behind a stark lesson about the fragile line between good and evil within the human heart. It showed how greed, selfishness, and blind lust can turn ordinary people into monsters. And above all, it showed the power of truth. A seemingly perfect crime, so cleverly concealed, was ultimately unraveled not by a complex clue, but by the innocent, pure testimony of a child. It was the love for his lost father that gave Leo the strength to speak the truth, making him an undeniable witness, an unwitting hero in this painful journey for justice.